Welcome back to Bible in a Year. I'm glad that you're here. I have been in Ethiopia for the past 2 weeks, which is why my hair is so fluffy, because I wasn't going to have access to a blow dryer. So I got a permanent. So that's why my hair is fluffy. Anyway, I'm glad you're here. And this week, what we're doing is we're reading Mark. Now, the author of Mark is known in the New Testament as John Mark. And John is his Jewish name. And Mark is his Roman name. He's known as John Mark. Barnabas was his cousin, according to Colossians chapter 4, verse 10. And he was a companion of Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey. But according to Acts 13, he seems to have deserted them, most likely because of the hardships of the first missionary journey. So later, he asked them to take him back and to take him on their second missionary journey. And Paul said, forget it. Forget it once and you're through. Sorry, one strike, you're out. Paul wouldn't let him come. So Barnabas was ready to give John Mark a second chance. And so for this reason, Barnabas and Paul separated. And according to Acts 15, according to Acts chapter 15, verses 36 and following, Paul took Silas and Barnabas took John Mark. Of course, this is what retrieved John Mark for the entire Christian community, and what stands behind Mark being retrieved enough to give us the gospel according to St. Mark. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Years later, John Mark did regain Paul's confidence, and he was with him in Rome, according to Colossians 4, verses 10 to 11, and 2 Timothy 4, verses 9 to 18. Unlike Matthew, Mark doesn't quote all kinds of prophecies from the Old Testament and show how Jesus fulfilled them, because that wouldn't have meant a whole lot to Mark's readers, who were Gentile Roman Christians. They were Gentiles, they were Romans. So instead, Mark emphasizes the power of Jesus' miracles. And Mark records Jesus' miracles instead of Jesus' teachings. Miracles play the same role in Mark that parables and discourses play in Matthew. Now, Matthew is writing for Jewish Christians. Matthew is writing to convert Jews. Mark is writing to Gentile Christians. Mark is writing to convert specifically Romans. Now, while Matthew and Luke have lengthy introductions and birth narratives and all of it, there's nothing like this in Mark. 7 of the 20 recorded miracles in Mark, and Mark is packed full of miracles, and 7 of the 20 of them occur on the Sabbath day. And Mark points out that Jesus says in Mark chapter 2, verse 27, that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. In Mark, Jesus tells only 4 parables as compared with the 15 that Matthew remembers him telling, because Mark is stressing Jesus' power rather than his teachings, his power over the demonic, his power over the storm, his power over illnesses, but he's not so much concerned with his teachings. In Mark chapter 11, verse 27, through Mark chapter 12, verse 44, Jesus is telling us about the final conflict with the Jewish, I don't mean Jesus, in Mark 11:27 through Mark 12:44, Mark is telling us about the final conflict with the Jewish authorities. And in these verses, we have 4 profound questions that are used to discredit Jesus. In 11:28, the chief priests and the elders and the scribes ask, "By what authority do you do the things that you do?" And what Jesus asks them in return is, "By what authority did John baptize?" Where did John's authority to baptize come from? And they don't dare answer, because if they say it came from God, he's going to say, then why didn't you listen to John? And if they say it came from people, they're scared to death that the crowd is going to turn on him. So they tell Jesus that they just can't answer that question. Jesus responds to them, "Then neither am I going to tell you by what authority I'm doing these things." Because what Jesus is telling them is, you don't care about truth. You don't care about what is true. You care about what is expedient. And so I'm not going to give you a straight answer to that question. Very smart of Jesus. Then in chapter 12:14, the Pharisees and the Herodians ask him, "Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" And see, this question is asking if, see, the head of a Roman coin had, or that on a Roman coin, you had the head of Caesar, which was a graven image. And so Jews weren't supposed to touch it. And this is why at the temple they had money changers, changing the Roman money into temple money. So they say, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And if Jesus says, yes, it is lawful, then the people are going to think that he hangs out with the Romans. And so the people are going to be mad. And if he says, no, it's really not lawful to pay taxes because you're not supposed to be using that money. If he says that, then of course the Romans are going to kill him. But what Jesus says is, whose head is on the coin? Jesus is very good. And then in chapter 12, verses 18 to 23, the Sadducees asked Jesus a question about the resurrection. See, they didn't believe in the resurrection. That's why they were sad. You see, the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. They believed that when you died, that was it. So they present Jesus with this hypothetical case. There's this woman. She's had all these husbands. One dies right after the next. She gets married again over and over. In the resurrection, whose wife is she going to be? This is in 12, verses 18 to 23. And Jesus' answer just pokes big holes in everything that they're thinking of. And then in chapter 12, verse 28, the scribes ask Jesus, and these are the religious lawyers who specialize in the Torah. They ask Jesus, so, what is the most important commandment? And they think they've really got him, because Torah tells that there are 2. Love God and love your neighbor. Love God is in Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 to 5, and love your neighbor is in Leviticus 19, verse 18. And they knew that Jesus couldn't answer what's the most important commandment in the law. But what Jesus says is there are 2 most important commandments in the law. Love God and love your neighbor. So those people who might say, well, Christianity is the first religion that preaches love. No, it isn't. Judaism preaches love. The law is that we are to love. We are to love God. We are to love our neighbor. That's what we are to do. And what we are to do is always the law. People who say, well, there's the law and then the gospel is love. They haven't really thought this through. If we are to do it, that's the law. But if God does it, that's the gospel. And what God has done is act powerfully in Jesus in order to save us. Now, in the story of the crucifixion, Mark doesn't tell us of the promise of the kingdom given to a dying thief. But that's because Mark really wants us to picture Jesus as Christ the servant, not Christ the king. He really wants us to see Christ the servant. That's why he also doesn't have Jesus saying, I could call 12,000 legions of angels and they would be at my, because that's the kind of thing that a king says. And Mark's Jesus is Christ the servant. And an interesting thing that we're going to talk about when we all get together is how Mark's gospel really ends with Mark chapter 16, verse 8, where the women run away from the angels who are at the empty tomb, and they're too afraid to tell anybody what has happened. And that's where Mark really ends. The women are too afraid to tell anybody. Now, Mark's first readers would have known that they told somebody because now they themselves, Mark's readers, were Christian. But this is the way the gospel, the earliest and the first gospel ends. And that's kind of its own great commission, isn't it? Because if the women never would have told anybody, and the disciples never would have told anybody, there wouldn't be these people gathered around listening to the gospel according to St. Mark being read. This is a very sophisticated ending, and we're going to talk about it, and we're going to talk about just exactly what it means when we meet again to talk about Mark and Luke. Read it, enjoy it, and I will see you again soon. Thanks a lot for coming. Bye.